Hey guys, tonight we're talking about how doctors solved the problem of misbehaving children and accidentally created the largest legal amphetamine distribution network in human history. Every school day, millions of American kids swallow pills containing the same chemical compound that kept Nazi soldiers awake during blitzkrieg attacks and helped 1950s housewives lose weight before it was banned for turning them into addicts. The drugs work exactly as intended. Children sit still, focus on boring tasks, stop annoying adults. But here's the twist nobody mentions. The disease being treated was invented after the cure was discovered. First came the pills that made rowdy kids obedient. Then came the diagnosis to justify giving those pills. Then came the multi-billion-dollar industry built on convincing parents their children's normal behavior was a brain disorder requiring lifelong medication. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand how we arrived at this pharmaceutical carnival, you first need to understand what happened in 1937 at a children's hospital in Rhode Island. Charles Bradley wasn't trying to revolutionize psychiatry that year. The physician was simply annoyed that his diagnostic equipment kept giving children terrible headaches. Emma Pendleton Bradley Home treated children with behavioral problems, learning difficulties, and various neurological conditions. Bradley used pneumoencephalography to examine his young patients, a barbaric procedure that involved draining spinal fluid and replacing it with air to make brain X-rays clearer. The technique worked for diagnosis, but left children with crushing headaches lasting days. Bradley theorized that constricting blood vessels in the brain might relieve the pain. He needed a vasoconstrictor, something to squeeze those vessels tight. Benzodrine sulfate seemed perfect for the job. Benzodrine was pure amphetamine, marketed since 1933 as an inhaler for nasal congestion and asthma. Smith, Kline and French sold millions of the inhalers yearly. Users quickly discovered that breaking open the inhaler and swallowing the amphetamine-soaked paper strips produced euphoria, boundless energy, and eliminated the need for sleep. Truck drivers used them for cross-country hauls. Students used them for all-night cramming. The company didn't discourage this creative usage. They introduced Benzodrine tablets in 1937 specifically for these off-label purposes. Bradley administered Benzodrine to 30 children recovering from pneumoencephalography. He waited for their headaches to improve. The headaches didn't budge. But something else happened that Bradley hadn't anticipated. The unruly children became calm. The unfocused became attentive. The academically struggling completed their schoolwork with sudden competence. Children who couldn't sit through a lesson were now model students. The transformation occurred within hours of taking the amphetamine and lasted throughout the day. Teachers at the facility noticed immediately. They started calling Benzodrine tablets arithmetic pills, because children who previously failed at basic math were suddenly working through problems methodically. The medication didn't make the children smarter. It made them compliant, focused on tedious tasks that normal children found boring. Bradley was witnessing something unprecedented. Every psychiatric medication discovered up to that point worked as expected. Sedatives sedated, stimulants stimulated, depressants depressed. This defied logic. Amphetamine was a powerful stimulant that made adults jittery, talkative, and manic. It should have made hyperactive children worse. Instead, it did the opposite. He ran a follow-up study on 100 children, carefully documenting results. 15 showed dramatic improvement in academic performance. 20 showed moderate improvement. The rest showed little change, but importantly, none became worse. Side effects were minimal, some appetite suppression, occasional insomnia. Bradley published his findings in 1937 in the American Journal of Psychiatry, under the dry title, The Behavior of Children Receiving Benzedrine. The medical community yawned. Bradley's discovery generated almost no interest from fellow physicians. Giving stimulants to children seemed counterintuitive and vaguely inappropriate. America in 1937 wasn't ready to medicate childhood behavior. The concept didn't fit existing frameworks of how medicine worked or what constituted legitimate treatment. Bradley published a second paper in 1941 with more data from additional studies. Again, silence greeted his work. The medical establishment ignored him, not because his research was flawed, but because it was too strange to integrate into contemporary thinking. Psychiatry was still dominated by psychoanalysis, which explained behavioral problems through unconscious conflicts and childhood trauma, not brain chemistry. Then World War II consumed everyone's attention. Amphetamines found their true calling on the battlefield. The military distributed Benzedrine tablets to soldiers by the millions. Pilots used them to stay alert during long bombing runs. Infantry took them before major offensives. The Germans gave their troops Pervitin, pure methamphetamine. The Japanese had their version. The British had theirs. Every major combatant nation in World War II discovered that amphetamines turned exhausted soldiers into tireless fighting machines. American forces consumed an estimated 200 million Benzedrine tablets during the war. Commanders viewed amphetamines as essential equipment, like ammunition or rations. The drugs allowed troops to function without sleep for days, maintained alertness during monotonous tasks, and eliminated fear during combat. Side effects like paranoia, psychosis, and cardiac problems were considered acceptable trade-offs for military effectiveness. After the war, millions of servicemen returned home with first-hand knowledge of amphetamines' effects. The pharmaceutical industry, having built massive production capacity for military contracts, needed new markets for their stockpiles. They found eager customers everywhere. Housewives discovered that Benzedrine eliminated appetite and provided energy for cleaning, cooking, and childcare. Smith, Klein, and French marketed amphetamines directly to women as weight loss aids and mood enhancers. Dexedrine, Obertrol, and a dozen other brands flooded pharmacy shelves. Print ads showed slim, smiling women in pristine kitchens, implying that amphetamines were the secret to domestic perfection. Truck drivers, students, and night shift workers used them to stay awake. Athletes used them for performance enhancement. Businessmen used them for the competitive edge they provided. Doctors prescribed them freely for depression, fatigue, weight loss, and dozens of other conditions. The 1950s became the golden age of pharmaceutical amphetamine use, legal, socially acceptable, and ubiquitous. Nobody called this an epidemic. Nobody warned about addiction. The drugs were legal, prescribed by doctors, manufactured by reputable pharmaceutical companies. They were modern medicine's gift to productivity and self-improvement. Then the problems started emerging. Women who took amphetamines for weight loss couldn't stop taking them without gaining the weight back plus extra. Tolerance developed. Users needed higher doses to achieve the same effects. Withdrawal brought crushing fatigue and depression. People who started taking amphetamines for legitimate medical reasons found themselves unable to function without them. Amphetamine psychosis began appearing in emergency rooms. Long-term users developed paranoid delusions, hallucinations, and violent behavior indistinguishable from schizophrenia. The symptoms disappeared when the drug use stopped, but many users couldn't stop. The medications that promised to solve life's problems had created new, worse problems. By the late 1950s, addiction stories were reaching newspapers. The respectable housewife narrative started cracking. Journalists wrote exposés about pep pills and diet pill addicts. The medical community began acknowledging that amphetamines were considerably more dangerous than originally marketed. but Charles Bradley's original discovery remained forgotten in the archives. Children's behavioral problems weren't a pharmaceutical industry priority. The pediatric market seemed small, ethically questionable, and unlikely to generate significant profits. Adults were buying amphetamines by the billions. Why complicate things by medicating children? That calculation was about to change. The pharmaceutical industry was facing a crisis by the 1960s. Amphetamine addiction scandals were mounting. Regulatory pressure was increasing. The golden goose of diet pills and pet pills was dying. Companies desperately needed a new, medically respectable use for their amphetamine stockpiles. Meanwhile, psychiatry was undergoing its own crisis. The field needed legitimacy, needed to prove it was real medicine with real diseases and real treatments. Vague talk about unconscious desires wasn't cutting it anymore. Psychiatrists wanted diagnoses they could measure, conditions they could treat with pills, disorders that looked scientific. These two industries, pharmaceuticals needing new markets and psychiatry needing validation, were about to discover they could solve each other's problems. All they needed was to transform normal childhood behavior into a medical condition requiring treatment. Bradley's forgotten research was about to become the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar industry. The mechanism was already proven. Give children amphetamines and they become obedient, focused, and easier to manage. Now someone just needed to invent a disease to justify it. The 1950s presented American psychiatry with an existential problem. Psychoanalysis dominated the field but produced no measurable results. Patients spent years on couches talking about their mothers, while their symptoms remained unchanged. Insurance companies were questioning why they should pay for treatments that couldn't demonstrate effectiveness. Medical schools were reducing psychiatry departments. The profession needed to prove it belonged in hospitals alongside surgeons and cardiologists. The solution was deceptively simple. Create a catalogue of mental diseases with specific diagnostic criteria, just like internal medicine had catalogues of physical diseases. If psychiatry could classify, measure, and categorize mental conditions, it would gain scientific legitimacy. The American Psychiatric Association began work on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a comprehensive taxonomy of every conceivable mental problem. Childhood behavioral problems presented a unique opportunity. Unlike schizophrenia or depression, which remained stubbornly difficult to treat, unruly children could be fixed relatively easily. Teachers and parents were already complaining about these kids constantly. All psychiatry needed was to frame these complaints as symptoms of an underlying medical condition. The first attempt at diagnosis came in 1957 when psychiatrist Maurice Loeffler published research on what he called hyperkinetic impulse disorder. Loeffler worked with children who couldn't sit still, follow instructions, or focus on schoolwork. He theorized they suffered from brain damage that caused excessive motor activity and poor impulse control. The brain damage theory had one small problem. No evidence of actual damage existed. Loeffler couldn't point to lesions, structural abnormalities, or anything physically wrong with these children's brains. Their neurons fired normally. Their brain scans looked identical to other children. They simply behaved in ways adults found intolerable. This lack of evidence proved surprisingly unimportant. The medical-sounding terminology provided cover for what was essentially a value judgment about acceptable childhood behavior. Brain damage sounded scientific even without proof. Other researchers jumped onto the concept. The term minimal brain damage started appearing in medical literature throughout the late 1950s. When the complete absence of actual brain damage became too obvious to ignore, researchers simply changed the name to minimal brain dysfunction. The condition transformed from damage you couldn't find to dysfunction you couldn't measure. A perfect, unfalsifiable hypothesis. Leon Eisenberg entered the picture in 1957 as a young psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins. He had read Bradley's forgotten amphetamine research and recognized its potential. Eisenberg began studying hyperactive children systematically, documenting their behaviors, testing various treatments, and building the scientific foundation for a new diagnosis. His research was methodical and convincing. Eisenberg identified specific behavioral patterns: excessive motor activity, short attention span, impulsivity, difficulty following rules. He demonstrated that these behaviors clustered together in certain children and caused significant problems at school and home. Most importantly, he showed that stimulant medications dramatically reduced these behaviors. Eisenberg's work provided exactly what psychiatry needed: a childhood condition with observable symptoms and effective pharmaceutical treatment. His papers were published in prestigious journals and cited widely. By the early 1960s, he had established himself as the leading expert on childhood hyperactivity. The timing was immaculate. Psychiatry was preparing the second edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Committees were meeting to determine which conditions deserved official recognition as mental disorders. Eisenberg's hyperactivity research arrived just as the DSM-II committee was considering childhood behavioral disorders. In 1968, the DSM-II officially recognized hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. The diagnostic criteria were remarkably vague: overactivity, restlessness, distractibility, and short attention span. No objective tests were required, no brain scans or blood work. A doctor simply observed the child's behavior and made a judgment call. The brilliance of these criteria was their inclusivity. Almost any energetic, curious, or strong-willed child could potentially qualify. The diagnosis didn't require the child to be significantly impaired, just different from the idealized model of a quiet, compliant, sedentary student who never questioned authority. Pharmaceutical companies had been watching these developments with intense interest. Their amphetamine empire was crumbling. Diet pill addiction scandals were mounting. The federal government was starting to regulate stimulant prescriptions more strictly. Adult markets were becoming legally and ethically problematic. But children's behavioral problems offered a solution. Parents desperately wanted help managing difficult kids. Teachers wanted classroom order. Schools wanted improved test scores. Everyone involved had incentives to embrace a medical solution to behavioral challenges. Ciba Pharmaceutical Company moved first. They had been producing Ritalin since the 1950s, with mediocre sales for adult fatigue and depression. The drug was chemically similar to amphetamine, but supposedly less addictive and gentler in its effects. Ciba's patents were approaching expiration, threatening to open the market to cheap generics. The company's executives realized that Bradley's old research and the new hyperkinetic reaction diagnosis created a perfect business opportunity. Ritalin could be repositioned as a children's medication, a safer, more appropriate alternative to harsh amphetamines. The pediatric market would be massive, renewable, and relatively unregulated compared to adult stimulant use. Ciba launched a marketing campaign in 1961 targeting pediatricians and child psychiatrists. Glossy brochures explained hyperkinetic reaction using simplified neuroscience illustrations. The materials emphasized that this was a medical condition requiring medical treatment, not a discipline problem requiring better parenting. The before and after photographs were particularly effective. The before images showed children looking wild-eyed, disruptive, surrounded by chaos. The after images showed the same children sitting calmly at desks, smiling at teachers, completing assignments. The message was unmistakable. Ritalin transformed problem children into ideal students. Ciba didn't stop with doctors. The company produced educational films for schools explaining how to identify hyperkinetic children. They distributed symptom checklists to teachers and encouraged them to flag students who matched the criteria. They funded parent education programs teaching mothers to recognize signs of the disorder in their own children. The strategy was ingenious. CIBA created demand from multiple directions simultaneously. Teachers identified problem students and suggested medical evaluation. Parents, armed with information from CIBA-funded programs, requested diagnosis from pediatricians. Doctors, having received CIBA's educational materials, knew exactly what medication to prescribe. Prescription rates climbed steadily throughout the 1960s. Hundreds of thousands of children were being medicated by the decade's end. The drugs worked mechanically. Children did sit still, focus on boring tasks, cause less disruption. Whether this represented treatment of disease or chemical enforcement of conformity was a question most people didn't ask. Critics emerged but were easily dismissed. Some pediatricians worried about medicating normal childhood energy. Some psychologists argued that behavioral problems reflected environmental factors like poor teaching, family stress, or inappropriate academic expectations. Some parents instinctively recoiled from giving their children amphetamine-like drugs. The pharmaceutical industry and supportive psychiatrists had a response ready for each objection. Concerns about normalcy were reframed as denying medical care to suffering children. Environmental explanations were dismissed as outdated psychoanalytic thinking that blamed parents instead of treating the real biological problem. Worries about medication were characterized as irrational fear of modern medicine. The reframing worked. Cultural attitudes shifted rapidly. Medicating children for behavioral problems transformed from controversial to routine. The diagnosis became a kind of explanation parents could accept, not that their child was bad or they were failing as parents, but that the child had a medical condition requiring treatment. School systems became particularly enthusiastic about the diagnosis. Hyperkinetic children were expensive to accommodate. They disrupted classrooms, required extra attention, and pulled down class averages on standardized tests. Medication made these children easier to manage with existing resources. Many districts began actively encouraging parents to pursue diagnosis and treatment. Federal funding accelerated the trend. Special education regulations in the early 1970s required schools to provide services for children with disabilities. Hyperkinetic reaction qualified as a disability requiring intervention. Schools that identified and treated more hyperkinetic children received more federal money. The incentive structure rewarded expanding diagnosis. Leon Eisenberg watched his research transform into a massive medical industry. In later years, he would express regret about how the diagnosis was being applied. He had studied severely impaired children who couldn't function in any setting. The diagnosis was spreading to include any child who annoyed adults. But by then, the machinery was self-sustaining and beyond any individual's control. The pharmaceutical companies had discovered something remarkable, a renewable market that expanded automatically. Every year, millions of new children entered the age range for diagnosis. Every diagnosed child represented years of medication purchases. Unlike acute illnesses that got cured, behavioral disorders required ongoing treatment. The customers never went away. They just aged into adult patients. The invention of hyperkinetic reaction marked a turning point in medical history. For the first time, a diagnosis was created specifically to justify an existing treatment rather than the reverse. The pharmaceutical industry had learned it could manufacture diseases as effectively as it manufactured drugs. All that was required was convincing people that normal human variation represented pathology requiring correction. This model would be refined and perfected over the following decades. The diagnosis would be renamed, expanded, and marketed more aggressively. New drugs would be developed and patented. The market would grow from hundreds of thousands to tens of millions of patients. But the foundation was laid in the 1960s when psychiatry and pharmaceutical companies discovered they could solve each other's problems by transforming childhood behavior into big business. Leandro Panizon was trying to solve a completely different problem in 1944 when he accidentally created the most profitable children's medication in pharmaceutical history. The Swiss chemist worked in Sieber's Basel laboratory, synthesizing stimulant compounds related to amphetamine. His employer wanted drugs that provided energy without amphetamine's harsh side effects and obvious addiction potential. Panizon created dozens of molecular variations, testing each one methodically. Compound number 6694 showed promise. It stimulated the central nervous system but felt smoother than amphetamine, less jittery, more controlled. He needed a test subject for longer-term evaluation. His wife Rita volunteered. She was an amateur tennis player who complained about fatigue during long matches. Panizon gave her the experimental compound before tennis games and tracked her performance. Rita reported that the drug improved her stamina, focus, and reaction time noticeably. She played better tennis on 6694 than off it. Panizon named his creation methylphenidate, but gave it the trade name Ritalin after his wife. The gesture was romantic in a pharmaceutical sort of way. Rita's enhanced tennis performance immortalized in a drug that would eventually be consumed by millions of children who'd never heard of her. Sieber introduced Ritalin to European markets in 1954 and American markets in 1955. The company marketed it for depression, chronic fatigue, lethargy, and narcolepsy. Sales were disappointing. Ritalin worked adequately but offered no clear advantage over existing medications. Doctors saw no reason to switch their depressed or tired patients to this new drug. The medication languished in Sieber's catalogue through the late 1950s, generating modest revenue but nothing exciting. Patent protection was ticking away. 17 years from synthesis meant Ritalin would face generic competition by 1961 unless something changed dramatically. Sieber's marketing department was desperately searching for new applications when someone discovered Bradley's 1937 benzodrine research. The connection seemed obvious in retrospect. Bradley had proven that stimulants calmed hyperactive children. Ritalin was a stimulant. The newly created hyperkinetic reaction diagnosis needed a treatment. Perfect alignment. The company filed for FDA approval to market Ritalin for hyperactive children in 1960. The application emphasized that methylphenidate was chemically distinct from amphetamine. Technically true but misleading since the drugs produced nearly identical effects. Sieber positioned Ritalin as the safe, appropriate choice for pediatric use compared to dangerous amphetamines that were causing addiction scandals. The FDA approved Ritalin for children in 1961 with minimal scrutiny. No long-term safety studies existed because the drug hadn't been used in children long enough for long-term studies. The approval was based on short trials showing the medication reduced hyperactive behaviors without obvious immediate harm. Questions about what happened after years of daily stimulant use in developing brains were considered premature. Sieber launched the most sophisticated pharmaceutical marketing campaign ever directed at children. The strategy wasn't to sell pills. It was to sell a disease concept that required pharmaceutical intervention. The company produced an educational film called The Paradox of Ritalin, distributed free to schools nationwide. The film explained hyperkinetic reaction using simplified neuroscience, showed dramatic before and after footage of medicated children, and positioned Ritalin as a miracle cure for classroom disruption. School administrators loved it because the film offered a medical solution to their most frustrating management problems. Teacher training materials followed. Sieber created detailed checklists allowing teachers to identify potentially hyperkinetic students. The checklists included behaviors like fidgets with hands or feet, talks excessively, has difficulty waiting turn, and doesn't seem to listen when spoken to directly. Almost every child exhibited these behaviours occasionally, but the materials encouraged teachers to flag students who showed them frequently. The genius was outsourcing diagnosis to people with no medical training, but strong incentives to identify problems. Teachers dealt with 30 students simultaneously in understaffed, overcrowded classrooms. Any child making their job harder became a potential candidate for medical intervention. The checklist transformed teacher frustration into medical referrals. Parent education materials were even more manipulative. Glossy brochures arrived at paediatrician offices featuring photographs of happy families and calm children. The before scenarios showed chaos. Toys scattered, homework incomplete, parents exhausted and arguing. The after scenarios showed order, organised rooms, completed assignments, family harmony. The implicit message was that Ritalin fixed broken families by fixing broken children. SIBA funded the creation of parent support groups for families with hyperkinetic children. These groups appeared grassroots but received significant pharmaceutical money for materials, meeting spaces and coordination. The group served dual purposes, providing genuine support while also normalizing medication and encouraging other parents to pursue diagnosis for their own difficult children. The most effective marketing tool was word of mouth from satisfied customers. Parents whose medicated children showed behavioral improvement became enthusiastic advocates. They shared their success stories at school meetings, neighborhood gatherings, and church events. They pushed other struggling parents to talk to your doctor about hyperkinetic reaction. Prescription rates climbed steadily through the 1960s. Hundreds of thousands of children were taking Ritalin by decade's end. The numbers were concentrated in white middle-class communities where parents had resources to pursue medical care and trusted pharmaceutical solutions. Poorer communities and minority families remained largely undiagnosed, not because their children behaved better, but because they lacked access to the diagnostic machinery. SIBA's revenue from Ritalin increased exponentially. The drug that had been a commercial disappointment became a blockbuster. The company's stock price reflected the transformation. Investors loved renewable pediatric markets. Every diagnosed child represented years of guaranteed medication purchases. Schools became increasingly dependent on Ritalin for classroom management. Districts with high diagnosis rates could maintain larger class sizes and reduce special education staff. The medication essentially subsidized inadequate educational resources by chemically adapting children to unsuitable learning environments. Critics began emerging by the late 1960s. Some pediatricians questioned whether normal childhood energy was being pathologized. Some psychologists warned that medicating behavior problems without addressing underlying causes would create long-term psychological issues. Some parents intuitively recoiled from giving their children stimulants daily for years. The term chemical straitjacket started appearing in critical articles. Journalists wrote exposés about schools pressuring parents to medicate children as a condition of enrollment. A few doctors published papers questioning whether the dramatic behavioral changes represented treatment or simply drug-induced compliance. SIBA and supportive psychiatrists had well-rehearsed responses. Critics were accused of denying medical care to suffering children. The chemical straitjacket metaphor was reframed as offensive to families managing genuine neurological conditions. Concerns about long-term effects were dismissed as speculation unsupported by evidence, conveniently ignoring that long-term evidence didn't exist yet. The company also deployed a more insidious tactic, funding research that consistently supported Ritalin use. SIBA provided grants to researchers studying hyperkinetic reaction, sponsored medical conferences where Ritalin's benefits were discussed, and supported academic departments that produced favourable publications. The research appeared independent but existed within a pharmaceutical-funded ecosystem that rewarded certain conclusions and discouraged others. Parent advocacy groups, many still receiving CIBA funding, attacked critics publicly. They wrote letters to editors, organised protests and lobbied legislators. These groups genuinely believed they were defending their children's medical care, unaware they were also defending CIBA's market share. By 1970, the debate was essentially over. Ritalin had achieved cultural acceptance. Medicating hyperactive children was standard medical practice. The diagnosis and treatment pipeline was established and self-sustaining. Tens of thousands of teachers were screening students. Tens of thousands of doctors were writing prescriptions. Millions of parents trusted the system. The machine CIBA created operated automatically now, requiring little ongoing effort to maintain momentum. New patients flowed in continuously as children reached diagnosis age. Existing patients rarely discontinued medication because withdrawal caused behavioural regression that confirmed the need for ongoing treatment. The system had become circular and self-perpetuating. Leon Eisenberg, whose research had legitimised the diagnosis, began expressing private doubts. He'd studied severely impaired children who couldn't function without intervention. The diagnosis had spread far beyond that population to include any child who annoyed adults, but his concerns were drowned out by the pharmaceutical medical educational complex he'd helped create. CIBA executives had no such doubts. They'd taken a failed drug and transformed it into a pediatric goldmine through pure marketing genius. They hadn't discovered a new disease or invented a new cure. They'd simply convinced millions of people that normal childhood variation required pharmaceutical correction. The Ritalin model would be studied and copied by every pharmaceutical company for decades. The lesson was clear. Creating demand for medication was more profitable than creating better medications. Marketing diseases was more lucrative than curing them, and children were the perfect market because they couldn't refuse treatment and their parents would pay any price to fix them. The foundation was laid. The diagnosis existed. The medication was flowing. The cultural acceptance was established. Now the pharmaceutical industry just needed to expand the market indefinitely. That would require making the diagnosis broader, the screening more aggressive, and the population of potential patients essentially limitless. The next phase was already beginning. The American Psychiatric Association faced a credibility crisis entering the 1980s. Previous versions of the DSM relied on psychoanalytic theory and vague descriptions that made consistent diagnosis impossible. Two psychiatrists evaluating the same patient might arrive at completely different conclusions. Insurance companies and medical schools were demanding something more rigorous, more scientific, more measurable. Robert Spitzer led the DSM-3 revision committee with a mandate to revolutionize psychiatric diagnosis. He wanted specific, observable criteria that any trained clinician could apply consistently. Childhood behavioral disorders were perfect candidates for this approach because behaviors were directly observable rather than relying on patient reports of internal states. The committee examining hyperkinetic reaction decided the name was outdated and limiting. Hyperkinetic implied constant motion, but many problematic children weren't particularly hyperactive. They were simply inattentive, distractible, or disorganized. Restricting diagnosis to overtly hyperactive kids was leaving money on the table. DSM-3 introduced attention deficit disorder in 1980, splitting it into two subtypes, ADD with hyperactivity and ADD without hyperactivity. This seemingly technical distinction revolutionized the pharmaceutical market by doubling the potential patient population overnight. The quiet daydreamers now qualified. Children who stared out windows during boring lessons had a disorder. Kids who forgot homework or lost track of time while reading had a medical condition. The diagnosis no longer required disruption or discipline problems. Simple failure to maintain focus on tedious tasks was sufficient. The diagnostic criteria were remarkably inclusive. A child needed to exhibit 6 out of 14 possible symptoms. The symptoms included common childhood behaviors like often fails to give close attention to details, often has difficulty organizing tasks, is often easily distracted, and often loses things. No objective tests were required. No timeline for how long symptoms needed to persist. A doctor simply checked boxes based on parent and teacher reports. Pharmaceutical companies recognized the significance immediately. The DSM-3 had just legitimized medicating an entirely new population of children who would have been considered normal under previous criteria. The quiet, disorganized kids were just as treatable with stimulants as the hyperactive ones, and there were far more of them. Research funding poured into ADHD studies from pharmaceutical sources throughout the 1980s. CEBA, which had merged with other companies to form what would eventually become Novartis, dramatically increased research grants to universities studying attention disorders. Other pharmaceutical companies producing stimulant medications followed suit. The funded research consistently found higher prevalence rates than earlier studies. Studies sponsored by pharmaceutical companies discovered ADHD in 10–15% of school-age children compared to 3–5% in earlier non-industry research. The discrepancy was explained away as better diagnostic tools and increased awareness, rather than financial conflicts of interest. Academic researchers depended on pharmaceutical funding for their careers. Grants paid salaries, funded laboratories, supported graduate students, and provided travel to conferences. Publishing papers that questioned ADHD prevalence or medication effectiveness risked losing those funding sources. The incentive structure ensured that most research supported expanded diagnosis and treatment. Medical conferences became pharmaceutical marketing opportunities disguised as education. Drug companies sponsored the major psychiatry and pediatrics meetings, paying for venues, meals, and speaker fees. The conferences featured presentations about ADHD diagnosis and treatment, with pharmaceutical representatives readily available to discuss their products. Doctors attending these conferences received continuing medical education credits required to maintain their licenses. The education was heavily weighted toward recognizing and treating ADHD. Speakers emphasized that the condition was significantly underdiagnosed and undertreated. Failing to identify ADHD was framed as denying children necessary medical care. CIBA and other companies refined the practice of ghostwriting academic papers. Pharmaceutical employees would draft research articles, then recruit academic physicians to put their names on the papers as authors. The academics received prestige and publication credits. The drug companies got papers in prestigious journals that appeared independent but promoted their products. The American Academy of Pediatrics became increasingly influenced by pharmaceutical funding. Drug companies sponsored the organization's annual meetings, provided grants for practice guidelines development, and employed pediatricians as consultants and speakers. In 2000, the AAP would issue guidelines recommending ADHD screening for all children aged 6–12, dramatically expanding the population subject to diagnosis. Schools transformed into diagnostic mills throughout the 1980s. Federal special education law required districts to identify and serve students with disabilities. ADHD qualified as a disability under other health impairment category. Schools that identified more ADHD students received more federal funding for special education services. Districts discovered they could satisfy legal requirements for ADHD students simply by ensuring medication compliance, rather than providing expensive behavioral interventions or classroom modifications. A medicated ADHD student required minimal accommodation. An unmedicated ADHD student required significant resources. The incentive structure favoured pharmaceutical solutions. Teachers received training on identifying ADHD symptoms through programs often funded by pharmaceutical companies. The training emphasised that ADHD was a medical condition teachers were ethically obligated to help identify. Failing to refer potentially ADHD students for evaluation was characterised as educational negligence. Rating scales and behavioural checklists proliferated. Teachers filled out standardised forms scoring student behaviours on numerical scales. These scores became quasi-medical data used by physicians to make diagnoses. The absurdity of basing medical diagnosis on teacher frustration level was rarely acknowledged. Some districts made medication an unofficial requirement for enrolment. Parents of diagnosed ADHD children received letters suggesting that keeping the child in school would require appropriate medical management. The schools couldn't legally mandate medication, but they could make continued enrolment contingently difficult for unmedicated ADHD students through disciplinary actions and suspension threats. The diagnosis rate exploded. By 1987, an estimated 500,000 American children were taking stimulant medication for ADHD, triple the number from a decade earlier. The increase was just beginning. DSM-3R arrived in 1987 with further expansions. The ADD-ADHD distinction was eliminated in favour of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, with 3 subtypes: predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, and combined. The criteria became even more inclusive. Now a child only needed to exhibit symptoms in one setting rather than multiple settings. Kids who behaved perfectly at home but struggled at school qualified. The duration requirement was reduced. The age of onset was pushed back, allowing diagnosis of children as young as 3 or 4. Each revision to diagnostic criteria captured additional children who previously wouldn't have qualified. The DSM-3R changes alone expanded the potential ADHD population by an estimated 30–40%. Pharmaceutical companies had successfully lobbied for broader criteria under the guise of improved diagnostic accuracy. Regional variations in diagnosis rates reveal the subjective nature of ADHD identification. Some counties diagnosed 5% of children while neighbouring counties diagnosed 20%. The variation correlated not with actual behavioural differences, but with prescribing patterns of local physicians, school district policies, and community attitudes toward medication. Wealthy suburban districts showed the highest diagnosis rates. These communities had resources to pursue medical evaluation, parents who trusted pharmaceutical interventions, and intense academic competition that rewarded any advantage. Medication became part of the achievement complex, like tutoring or test prep, just another tool for optimizing children's performance. The medications worked exactly as intended. Medicated children sat still longer, focused on boring tasks better, completed more homework, and caused less classroom disruption. Academic performance often improved, at least by metrics like homework completion and test scores. Teachers reported dramatic improvements in classroom manageability. Whether this represented treatment of disease or chemical enforcement of institutional compliance was a question most people avoided asking. The drugs produced desirable behavioural changes that were sufficient for parents, teachers, and doctors to continue the system. Side effects were systematically minimized. Appetite suppression, sleep disruption, growth delays, anxiety, mood changes, and personality alterations were described as minor and manageable. Long-term cardiovascular risks weren't yet apparent because children hadn't been medicated long enough for long-term data to exist. Some children reported feeling like zombies on medication, emotionally flat, creativity diminished, personality muted. These complaints were often dismissed as adjustment issues or incorrect dosing rather than fundamental problems with medicating childhood behavior. Doctors would adjust the dose or switch medications rather than questioning whether the medication was appropriate at all. The children themselves had no voice in these decisions. Parents and doctors decided whether they would take stimulants daily, often for years. A child's preference not to take medication was treated as lack of insight into their own condition, rather than a legitimate choice about their mental state. By 1990, ADHD had achieved complete cultural acceptance. The diagnosis was so normalised that parents competed to get it for their children. An ADHD diagnosis meant extended time on standardised tests, reduced academic expectations, and legal protections under disability law. In achievement-oriented communities, ADHD became a desirable label that provided advantages without significant stigma. Pharmaceutical companies had achieved something remarkable. They transformed a rare diagnosis applied to severely impaired children into a common condition affecting millions. They'd made medication the default response to any attention or behavioural issue. They'd created a system where everyone involved had incentives to expand diagnosis and treatment, regardless of actual medical necessity. The diagnosis rate had increased nearly tenfold in 2 decades. Millions of children were taking stimulants daily. The market was worth billions annually, and the pharmaceutical industry was just getting started. The next frontier was adults. If childhood ADHD was real, then surely some percentage of children carried their condition into adulthood. That insight would transform ADHD from a pediatric market into a lifelong pharmaceutical dependency affecting tens of millions of people. The companies were already planning their campaigns. Richwood Pharmaceuticals was a tiny company occupying rented office space in Kentucky when it stumbled onto a business strategy that would generate billions. The firm had 20 employees, minimal revenue, and no successful products. Its executives were desperately searching for any pharmaceutical asset they could acquire cheaply and repurpose profitably. They found it in the abandoned catalogue of an obscure company called Rexa Pharmacal. Buried in Rexa's intellectual property was a drug called Obertrol, mixed amphetamine salts marketed as an obesity treatment throughout the 1970s. The medication had been pulled from the market during the amphetamine addiction scandals, but the formula still existed, gathering dust in expired patent files. Obertrol was literally 4 different amphetamine compounds mixed together: dextroamphetamine saccharate, amphetamine aspartate, dextroamphetamine sulfate, and amphetamine sulfate. The combination produced stronger effects than any single amphetamine compound. Weight loss patients had lost significant weight on Obertrol before the medication was withdrawn due to addiction concerns. Richwood executives recognized what they had discovered. The ADHD market was booming but dominated by Ritalin, which was about to face generic competition. The market needed a new branded medication that could command premium prices. Amphetamines were known to treat ADHD effectively. Bradley had proven that 6 decades earlier. The strategy was brazenly simple. Take the exact same drug that had been banned for making adults addicted, rebrand it for children, and market it as ADHD treatment rather than diet medication. Change nothing about the chemical compound. Just change the label, the marketing message, and the target population. Richwood renamed Obertrol to Adderall, a portmanteau suggesting ADD for all. The name was marketing genius, implying the drug was specifically designed for attention deficit disorder rather than being repurposed amphetamine. The company filed for FDA approval in 1994, claiming Adderall was a new treatment for ADHD. The FDA application downplayed that Adderall was identical to Obertrol and contained the same amphetamines that were considered too dangerous for diet use. The application emphasized new research showing effectiveness for ADHD, while glossing over decades of research showing addiction potential. The FDA approved Adderall in 1996, after reviewing clinical trials involving just 48 children studied for 4 weeks. No long-term safety data existed. No studies examined effects of daily amphetamine consumption on developing brains over years. The approval was based on demonstrating that Adderall reduced ADHD symptoms in the short term without causing obvious immediate harm. Richwood priced Adderall significantly higher than generic Ritalin. The company positioned it as superior to Ritalin because it lasted longer and required fewer daily doses. The convenience of once or twice daily dosing versus 3 or 4 times daily appealed to parents, teachers, and patients managing medication schedules. Doctors began prescribing Adderall based on pharmaceutical representative visits and free samples. Richwood hired an aggressive sales force that visited pediatricians and psychiatrists regularly. The representatives brought lunch for office staff, provided educational materials about ADHD, and left generous sample supplies that doctors could distribute to patients. The free samples were particularly effective. Parents whose children responded well to sample medication would request prescriptions to continue treatment. Doctors who'd seen positive responses in sample patients became comfortable prescribing the medication to other patients. The samples created both patient demand and physician comfort simultaneously. Adderall sales climbed faster than Richwood's tiny infrastructure could support. The company couldn't manufacture enough medication to meet demand. Distribution problems created shortages that ironically increased the drug's mystique. Patients and doctors wanted the medication that was so popular it kept selling out. Shire Pharmaceuticals was watching from across the Atlantic. The British-based company specialized in acquiring promising pharmaceutical assets and scaling them into blockbusters. Shire executives recognized that Adderall could become a multi-billion-dollar franchise with proper marketing and manufacturing support. Shire acquired Richwood Pharmaceuticals in 1997 for $186 million. The price seemed astronomical for a company with one product that was just rebranded amphetamine. But Shire's executives understood they weren't buying a drug. They were buying a market position in the fastest-growing pharmaceutical sector. Shire immediately invested hundreds of millions into Adderall marketing. The company's campaign made Ciba's Ritalin marketing look amateurish by comparison. Shire deployed every tool available to pharmaceutical companies in the late 1990s, including tactics that would later be restricted or banned. Direct-to-consumer advertising became Shire's primary weapon. Television commercials during family programming showed struggling students transformed by ADHD treatment. The ads never mentioned Adderall specifically. FDA rules required listing side effects in any drug advertisement, but they told viewers to ask your doctor about ADHD treatment options. The commercials were emotionally manipulative masterpieces. They showed children frustrated with homework, parents exhausted from behavioral conflicts, and teachers overwhelmed by classroom chaos. Then came the transformation. The same families and classrooms shown peaceful and productive after ADHD treatment. The implicit message was that family dysfunction stemmed from undiagnosed medical conditions rather than normal childhood challenges. Print advertisements appeared in parenting magazines, women's publications, and education journals. The ads used similar before and after imagery, but could include more detailed information about symptoms. They featured checklists allowing parents to self-diagnose their children, always worded to maximize positive responses. Shire created websites where parents could complete ADHD screening questionnaires and print results to bring to doctors. The screening tools were designed to identify as many potential ADHD cases as possible. Questions like, does your child have trouble staying focused on tasks? And does your child often lose things? Would trigger positive screens for virtually any normal child. The company funded celebrity spokespeople who discussed their own ADHD diagnoses publicly. Athletes, entertainers, and business figures shared stories about struggling with undiagnosed ADHD and finding success after treatment. These testimonials normalized the diagnosis and suggested that ADHD treatment was an edge rather than a disability accommodation. Shire sponsored ADHD awareness campaigns that appeared educational but functioned as marketing. The campaigns emphasized that ADHD was underdiagnosed and undertreated, that millions of children were suffering needlessly, and that effective treatments existed. The campaigns never mentioned Adderall but directed people to doctors who would inevitably prescribe it. Parent advocacy groups received substantial Shire funding. CHAD, Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, became partially dependent on pharmaceutical money. The organization promoted ADHD awareness, supported expanded diagnosis, and advocated for medication access while receiving millions from companies selling ADHD drugs. The marketing strategy worked spectacularly. Adderall prescriptions increased exponentially year over year. By 2000, Adderall had captured significant market share from Ritalin. The medication was generating hundreds of millions in annual revenue and growing rapidly. Shire's success triggered a pharmaceutical gold rush. Other companies scrambled to develop or acquire ADHD medications to compete in the booming market. Pharmaceutical executives recognized that ADHD was the perfect product category, a subjectively diagnosed condition with no objective tests, treatment lasting years or decades, a renewable customer base as children aged into diagnosis, and strong demand from parents, teachers, and schools. The competitive pressure drove increasingly aggressive marketing. Companies sponsored research demonstrating their product's superiority. They funded continuing medical education that emphasized choosing appropriate medications. They hired key opinion leaders, prominent physicians who would speak at conferences and write papers promoting specific medications. Pharmaceutical representatives visiting doctors became ubiquitous. Primary care physicians received multiple visits weekly from different representatives promoting various ADHD medications. The representatives brought free lunches, offered tickets to sporting events and concerts, funded medical conferences at resort locations, and provided generous samples. Many doctors maintained genuine belief they were providing necessary medical care. They saw children struggling academically and behaviorally. They prescribed medication and observed improvement. The cause and effect seemed clear. Whether the improvement represented treatment of disease or stimulant-induced compliance didn't occur to most prescribers or didn't seem to matter. Schools became increasingly dependent on pharmaceutical solutions to manage student behavior. Budget cuts throughout the 1990s reduced school psychologists, counselors, and special education staff. Class sizes increased. Academic standards intensified. Teachers were expected to manage larger classes of more challenging students with fewer resources. Medication offered the path of least resistance. A medicated ADHD student required minimal accommodation. An unmedicated student required individualized attention, behavioral interventions, and classroom modifications that overwhelmed staff lacked time and resources to provide. District administrators quietly encouraged diagnosis and medication as a cost-effective alternative to expensive services. Some schools made medication a de facto enrollment requirement. Parents of diagnosed ADHD students received suggestions that continued enrollment depended on appropriate medical management of the condition. The schools couldn't legally mandate medication, but they could make life impossible for families who refused through constant disciplinary actions and suspension threats. The diagnostic pipeline became industrialized. Teachers identified potentially ADHD students using pharmaceutical-funded checklists. School counsellors recommended medical evaluation. Parents consulted paediatricians who relied on teacher reports for diagnosis. Doctors prescribed medications promoted by pharmaceutical representatives. The cycle perpetuated itself automatically, requiring minimal effort to maintain momentum. Adderall's popularity created a bizarre status symbol in affluent communities. Having an ADHD diagnosis signaled that parents were attentive enough to recognize learning issues and wealthy enough to pursue treatment. The diagnosis carried minimal stigma in achievement-oriented suburbs where everyone was seeking any possible advantage for their children. Extended test time became the prize everyone wanted. Students with ADHD diagnoses received 50% additional time on standardized tests, including college entrance exams. In competitive school districts, ADHD diagnosis rates exploded as parents pursued accommodations that could significantly boost test scores. The accommodation system created perverse incentives throughout the diagnostic process. Parents wanted the diagnosis for advantages it provided. Psychologists conducting evaluations knew that finding ADHD meant satisfied customers and repeat business. Doctors prescribing medications received positive feedback from grateful parents whose children's test scores improved. Everyone involved benefited from expanding diagnosis regardless of medical necessity. College admissions offices noticed the pattern. Applications from wealthy suburban schools showed ADHD diagnosis rates approaching 30% compared to 35% from lower-income schools. The disparity reflected not actual behavioral differences, but access to diagnostic resources and knowledge of accommodation systems. Shire's revenue from Adderall approached $1 billion annually by the early 2000s. The medication had become one of the most profitable pharmaceutical products in America. Other companies watched enviously and scrambled to develop competing medications that could capture portions of the lucrative market. The ADHD pharmaceutical market had reached critical mass. The diagnosis was normalized and desirable. Multiple medications competed for market share. Insurance covered treatment. Schools encouraged diagnosis. Parents demanded access. Doctors prescribed reflexively. The system had become self-perpetuating and essentially unstoppable. But Shire executives recognized that pediatric markets had inherent limitations. Children eventually became adults and stopped seeing pediatricians. Many discontinued medication after high school. The company was losing customers to aging rather than competition. The solution was obvious. Convince adults they had ADHD too. Expand the market from children to the entire population. Transform ADHD from a pediatric condition into a lifelong disorder requiring permanent pharmaceutical management. Shire was already planning the campaign that would double their market size overnight. The adult ADHD revolution was about to begin. Pharmaceutical executives realized something obvious in the late 1990s that would transform ADHD into the most profitable psychiatric diagnosis in history. Children diagnosed with ADHD didn't stop having ADHD when they turned 18. If the condition was truly a lifelong neurological disorder, then millions of adults were walking around with undiagnosed, untreated ADHD. The pediatric market had natural limits. Children aged out of pediatrician care. Many discontinued medication after finishing school. Parents stopped paying for prescriptions when kids left home, but adults could be customers forever, paying for their own medications, seeking their own refills, managing their own treatment indefinitely. Shire Pharmaceuticals commissioned research examining ADHD persistence into adulthood. The studies, funded entirely by companies selling ADHD medications, consistently found that 60 to 80% of children with ADHD continued experiencing symptoms as adults. This percentage was dramatically higher than earlier independent research suggested, but the new studies had better methodology and larger sample sizes. Or so the pharmaceutical-funded researchers claimed. The research created the foundation for marketing campaigns targeting adults. If ADHD persisted into adulthood at rates much higher than previously believed, then millions of American adults were suffering needlessly from an undiagnosed condition. They just needed to recognize their symptoms and seek treatment. Shire launched adult ADHD awareness campaigns in 2004, with television advertisements featuring adults struggling with everyday tasks. The commercials showed business professionals losing track during meetings, parents forgetting appointments, workers unable to complete projects. A narrator asked viewers if they experienced similar difficulties and suggested consulting a doctor about ADHD. The symptoms described in advertisements were deliberately vague and universal. Do you have trouble getting organized? Do you often lose your keys or phone? Do you struggle to stay focused during boring tasks? Do you frequently interrupt others in conversation? These behaviors described virtually every adult at some point, but the advertisements framed them as potential ADHD symptoms. Print advertisements appeared in business magazines, airline magazines, and news publications targeting professional adults. The ads featured successful-looking people who'd overcome ADHD with treatment. They emphasized that ADHD wasn't a character flaw or lack of discipline, but a legitimate medical condition affecting brain chemistry. Shire created websites offering adult ADHD screening questionnaires. The questionnaires asked about common life frustrations, difficulty managing finances, problems with punctuality, trouble completing household chores, forgetting important dates. Answering yes to 6 out of 18 questions suggested possible ADHD and recommended professional evaluation. The questionnaires were designed to maximize positive screens. Questions were phrased to capture normal human imperfection rather than pathological dysfunction. Do you often make careless mistakes in your work? Who hasn't? Do you have difficulty sustaining attention during leisure activities? Everyone gets bored sometimes, but answering honestly to these universal experiences suggested medical pathology requiring pharmaceutical intervention. Online screening tools exploded in popularity. Millions of adults completed the questionnaires and discovered they might have ADHD. The revelation was often met with relief. Suddenly, their lifetime of struggles with organization, focus, and follow-through had a medical explanation that absolved them of personal responsibility. Physicians were initially skeptical about diagnosing ADHD in adults who'd functioned adequately for decades without treatment. Shire addressed this skepticism by funding continuing medical education courses about adult ADHD. The courses emphasized that adults often developed coping mechanisms that masked symptoms, that childhood ADHD frequently persisted into adulthood, and that effective treatments were available. Key opinion leaders, prominent psychiatrists who received consulting fees and speaking honorariums from Shire, published papers about adult ADHD in medical journals. The papers used pharmaceutical-funded research to establish adult ADHD as a legitimate, common, and treatable condition. The authors disclosed their financial relationships with drug companies in fine print that few readers examined carefully. Doctors began diagnosing adult ADHD based on patients' self-reports of symptoms. No objective tests existed. The diagnosis relied entirely on whether patients claimed to experience the listed symptoms. Since the symptoms were universal human experiences, almost anyone seeking diagnosis could obtain it by answering questionnaire honestly. The adult ADHD market exploded faster than anyone anticipated. Adults actively sought diagnosis, unlike children who were brought to doctors by concerned parents. Adult patients paid for their own prescriptions, eliminating parental gatekeeping. Insurance companies covered ADHD treatment, removing financial barriers. The market grew exponentially. Shire introduced Adderall XR, extended release, in 2001 specifically targeting the adult market. The once-daily formulation was marketed as more convenient and professional-friendly than immediate-release Adderall requiring multiple daily doses. Adderall XR was priced significantly higher than generic immediate-release versions, allowing Shire to maintain premium margins despite growing generic competition. The extended-release formulation also renewed patent protection. Generic Adderall threatened to devastate Shire's profits, but Adderall XR was protected by new patents lasting until 2009. Doctors were encouraged to switch patients from immediate-release to extended-release versions through marketing emphasizing improved compliance and convenience. College campuses became epicenters of adult ADHD diagnosis. Students struggling with academic pressures sought any available advantage. University health centers were overwhelmed with students requesting ADHD evaluation. Some schools diagnosed 20–30% of students with ADHD, rates far exceeding general population estimates. Campus psychiatrists and psychologists faced difficult ethical choices. Students presented claiming symptoms that matched ADHD criteria perfectly. Denying diagnosis meant accusing students of lying or denying them potential medical care. Providing diagnosis meant potentially enabling medication misuse, but also helping students who might genuinely struggle. Many campus clinicians chose to believe students and provide requested diagnoses. The alternative, being known as the doctor who wouldn't diagnose ADHD, would drive students elsewhere. Private psychiatrists near universities would happily provide diagnoses that campus doctors refused. Market forces incentivized generous diagnostic practices. The medications became currency on college campuses. Students with prescriptions sold or gave pills to friends before exams. Non-prescribed use of ADHD medications for studying became normalized across universities. Surveys found that 20–30% of students had used stimulant medications without prescriptions at least once. The black market created by college students ironically benefited pharmaceutical companies. Pills diverted to non-prescribed users expanded the population experiencing medication benefits. Some students who use pills recreationally eventually sought their own prescriptions. The illegal market functioned as free sampling that created future legitimate customers. Pharmaceutical companies publicly expressed concern about prescription stimulant diversion while privately benefiting from expanded usage. They funded awareness campaigns about medication abuse while simultaneously marketing medications more aggressively. DA production quotas for prescription amphetamines increased every year to meet growing demand that included both legitimate prescriptions and black market diversion. Shire introduced Vyvanse in 2007 as the next evolution in ADHD medication. The drug was a prodrug, a compound that became active only after metabolization in the body. This made Vyvanse theoretically less abusable than Adderall because snorting or injecting it wouldn't produce rapid effects. Vyvanse was priced even higher than Adderall XR and protected by patents lasting until 2023. Shire marketed it as safer and less prone to abuse, though the actual clinical differences were marginal. The medication worked by being converted to dextroamphetamine in the bloodstream. It was ultimately the same drug with a time delay mechanism. Doctors began prescribing Vyvanse preferentially due to aggressive marketing and perceived abuse resistance. Shire's sales representatives emphasized Vyvanse's novel mechanism and improved safety profile. The company offered generous samples and copay assistance programs that made Vyvanse more affordable than cheaper generic alternatives. By 2010, adult ADHD prescriptions exceeded pediatric prescriptions for the first time. The adult market had become larger and more profitable than the children's market that started everything. Adults took medications long-term without aging out, paid for prescriptions themselves, and actively advocated for their own treatment continuation. Professional adults became particularly enthusiastic consumers. Workers in competitive industries used medications to maintain productivity during long hours. Lawyers, bankers, consultants, and technology workers relied on stimulants to sustain focus through demanding schedules. The medications functioned as performance enhancers in cognitively demanding careers. Some professionals questioned whether they had ADHD or simply worked in environments requiring superhuman focus and productivity. The distinction became meaningless. Whether stimulants treated disease or enhanced normal performance, they worked. People taking them outperformed people who weren't. Market pressure pushed everyone toward pharmaceutical enhancement. The normalization of adult ADHD created feedback loops that expanded diagnosis continuously. People whose medicated friends showed improved productivity sought their own diagnoses. Office workers seeing colleagues using stimulants wanted access to the same tools. The medications became competitive necessities in achievement-oriented environments. Pharmaceutical companies deployed sophisticated marketing targeting different adult demographics. Stay-at-home parents struggling with household management saw advertisements emphasizing how ADHD treatment improved daily functioning. Executives saw marketing about enhanced workplace performance. Students saw messaging about academic achievement. Each demographic received customized appeals designed to resonate with their specific struggles and aspirations. The industry created a cultural narrative where any difficulty with attention, organization, or productivity suggested possible ADHD. Life challenges that previous generations addressed through time management, behavioral changes, or environmental modifications were reframed as symptoms of neurological disorder requiring pharmaceutical intervention. Adults who'd functioned adequately for decades suddenly discovered they'd been suffering from undiagnosed ADHD their entire lives. The diagnosis explained every past failure, every missed deadline, every forgotten appointment as symptoms of medical condition rather than personal shortcomings. The narrative was psychologically appealing even if medically questionable. Some adults genuinely benefited from diagnosis and treatment. They experienced significant functional improvements and felt medications were life-changing. But the diagnostic criteria were so broad that many diagnosed adults fell within normal human variation rather than pathological dysfunction. The system couldn't distinguish between the two groups and made no attempt to try. Adult ADHD became self-diagnosing and self-perpetuating. People read symptoms lists, recognized themselves, sought evaluation, received diagnosis, and became advocates encouraging others to seek evaluation. The diagnosis spread through social networks like a viral idea rather than a medical condition. Shire's revenue from ADHD medications exceeded $2 billion annually by 2012. Vyvanse alone generated over $1 billion yearly. The adult market had transformed ADHD from a pediatric niche into a blockbuster pharmaceutical franchise. Other companies introduced competing medications trying to capture market share from Shire's dominance. The adult ADHD explosion vindicated the pharmaceutical industry's decades-long investment in expanding the diagnosis. Starting with Bradley's accidental discovery and Cyber's early Ritalin marketing, the industry had systematically grown ADHD from a rare condition affecting a few thousand severely impaired children into a common diagnosis affecting tens of millions of children and adults. The market showed no signs of saturation. Screening campaigns continued identifying previously undiagnosed adults. Direct-to-consumer advertising reached new demographics. Pharmaceutical-funded research discovered ADHD in populations previously considered unaffected. Women were underdiagnosed, minorities were underdiagnosed, older adults were underdiagnosed. Every study expanded the potential market. The adult ADHD phenomenon demonstrated the ultimate success of pharmaceutical disease marketing. The industry had convinced millions of people that normal human struggles with attention and organization represented neurological pathology requiring lifelong medication, and those millions of people were grateful for the diagnosis, enthusiastic about treatment, and evangelical about spreading awareness to others who might also be suffering unknowingly. The machine was now operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Children were being diagnosed in schools. College students were seeking diagnosis for academic advantages. Young professionals were using medications for career enhancement. Older adults were discovering lifelong ADHD explained their struggles. The market captured people at every life stage and kept them as customers indefinitely. The ADHD pharmaceutical market crossed $13 billion annually in 2015. That figure represented more money than the entire GDP of some small nations, all flowing from diagnosing attention problems and prescribing stimulants. Shire Pharmaceuticals alone extracted over $2 billion yearly from Vivant's sales, a single medication generating more revenue than many Fortune 500 companies' entire operations. The industry had perfected a business model that every pharmaceutical executive studied enviously. Fund research expanding diagnostic criteria, sponsor medical conferences where doctors learn to recognize symptoms, finance patient advocacy groups that demanded treatment access, advertise directly to consumers who would then pressure physicians for prescriptions, lobby for insurance coverage that eliminated cost barriers. The system was elegant, self-perpetuating, and virtually unstoppable. Generic medications threatened this profitable empire continuously. When Adderall's patents expired, generic manufacturers flooded the market with cheap alternatives. Shire's response demonstrated the pharmaceutical industry's ruthless sophistication in protecting profit margins against legitimate competition. The company created artificial shortages of generic Adderall by controlling key manufacturing components and distribution channels. Patients arriving at pharmacies found generic versions unavailable due to supply issues. Pharmacists apologetically explained that generic Adderall was on back order, but expensive brand name alternatives were readily available. Insurance companies often covered both, so patients accepted the substitution without realizing they'd been manipulated into premium-priced medications. The shortages were carefully engineered to appear like ordinary supply chain problems rather than strategic market manipulation. DA production quotas, manufacturing delays, distribution bottlenecks, legitimate explanations existed for every shortage. But the pattern was unmistakable. Generic versions of older medications mysteriously became scarce, while expensive brand name alternatives remained abundantly stocked. Shire and other companies also deployed pay-for-delay agreements with generic manufacturers. The brand name company would pay generic competitors to postpone launching cheaper alternatives for several years. These agreements were technically legal until regulatory crackdowns in the mid-2010s, by which point billions in extra profits had already been extracted from patients and insurance systems. The industry continuously searched for untapped markets within the ADHD diagnosis. Early marketing targeted white, middle-class boys who fit the stereotypical hyperactive profile. But that demographic was approaching market saturation. Nearly 20% were diagnosed in some affluent suburban districts. Growth required expanding into populations with lower diagnosis rates. Pharmaceutical companies funded research demonstrating that ADHD was dramatically underdiagnosed in girls and women. The studies revealed that females displayed different symptoms than males, less hyperactivity, more inattention and daydreaming. The research was scientifically plausible and conveniently opened an entirely new market of tens of millions of potential patients. Marketing campaigns targeting women emphasized that female ADHD often manifested as disorganization, emotional dysregulation, and difficulty managing multiple responsibilities. The symptoms described were common experiences of women juggling careers, childcare, and household management. But pharmaceutical messaging reframed these universal struggles as possible neurological disorder requiring treatment. Similar campaigns targeted racial minorities, claiming that ADHD was underdiagnosed in Black and Hispanic communities due to cultural barriers and healthcare disparities. The framing was socially progressive while serving pharmaceutical profit motives. Companies positioned themselves as advocates for marginalized populations while simultaneously expanding their customer base. Shire introduced medications in multiple formulations to capture different market segments and extend patent protection indefinitely. Vyvanse came in capsules, chewable tablets, and dissolving powders. Each formulation required separate FDA approval and received separate patent protection. The medical justification was providing options for patients with different needs. The business justification was maintaining premium pricing for decades beyond original patent expiration. Insurance coverage became a pharmaceutical industry priority. Companies employed armies of lobbyists pressuring insurance providers to cover ADHD medications without restrictions. The industry argued that denying coverage for legitimate medical conditions was discriminatory and violated mental health parity laws. Insurance companies, facing legal threats and public pressure, agreed to cover ADHD medications with minimal prior authorization requirements. The generous insurance coverage created moral hazard. Patients paid minimal co-pays, often $10 to $30 monthly, while insurance companies absorbed costs of several $100s per prescription. Neither patients nor doctors faced financial consequences of prescribing expensive brand-name medications when cheaper alternatives existed. The disconnect between actual costs and perceived costs encouraged overconsumption. Pharmaceutical representatives visiting doctors became increasingly sophisticated in their sales techniques. Representatives tracked individual physician prescribing patterns using pharmacy data. They knew which doctors prescribed generics versus brand names, which favored Vyvanse versus Adderall XR, which were heavy prescribers versus conservative. Marketing approaches were customized for each physician based on detailed analytics. High-prescribing doctors received special attention. Pharmaceutical companies invited them to serve as consultants, speakers, and researchers. The consulting fees and speaking honorariums were technically payment for medical expertise, but functionally were rewards for prescribing patterns favorable to company products. Doctors who prescribed Vyvanse frequently were offered lucrative speaking opportunities at medical conferences to discuss ADHD treatment approaches. The revolving door between pharmaceutical companies and regulatory agencies ensured friendly oversight. FDA officials reviewing ADHD medications often had previous employment at pharmaceutical companies or would accept industry positions after leaving government service. Advisory panel members frequently had financial relationships with companies whose products they evaluated. Conflicts of interest were disclosed but rarely disqualifying. Academic research became thoroughly corrupted by pharmaceutical funding. Companies sponsored studies designed to produce favorable results through careful selection of research questions, outcome measures, and analysis methods. Negative results were buried through strategic non-publication. Positive results were published in prestigious journals and promoted extensively through press releases and medical conferences. Meta-analyses examining long-term outcomes of ADHD medication showed surprisingly modest benefits. Children medicated for ADHD showed minimal long-term academic advantages compared to unmedicated peers. Some studies suggested that medication benefits disappeared within a few years of continuous use, possibly due to tolerance or compensatory brain changes. These inconvenient findings received little attention from pharmaceutical-funded researchers or medical conferences. Side effects of long-term stimulant use were systematically minimized in medical literature and drug information materials. Appetite suppression was described as manageable through medication timing. Growth delays in medicated children were acknowledged but characterized as minor and likely temporary. Cardiovascular risks were mentioned in fine print but downplayed in actual clinical discussions. More troubling side effects were rarely discussed openly. Personality changes in medicated children, emotional flatness, reduced spontaneity, dampened creativity were difficult to quantify objectively, but frequently reported by parents and patients. Some children described feeling like different people on medication, disconnected from their authentic selves. These subjective experiences didn't fit into clinical trial outcome measures and were largely ignored. Dependency issues were carefully avoided in pharmaceutical messaging. Companies insisted that ADHD medications weren't addictive when taken as prescribed. This was technically accurate using narrow definitions of addiction focused on physical withdrawal symptoms and compulsive use patterns. But many patients discovered they couldn't function normally without their medications after years of continuous use, a dependency that might not meet clinical addiction criteria but certainly resembled it. Sleep disruption affected many medicated patients. Stimulants interfered with normal sleep architecture, reducing sleep quality even when total sleep duration seemed adequate. Chronic sleep deprivation in developing children had no negative effects on brain development, physical growth, and emotional regulation. But these harms were difficult to attribute directly to medication versus other factors, so they remained largely unexplored in pharmaceutical-funded research. Anxiety and mood problems increased in some medicated patients. Stimulants could trigger or worsen anxiety disorders, create irritability and emotional volatility, and in rare cases precipitate manic episodes or psychosis. These serious side effects were mentioned in prescribing information, but rarely discussed during the brief appointment where doctors initiated treatment. Some children spent their entire childhoods medicated, never experiencing their unmedicated baseline personality. They didn't know who they were without stimulants. Their parents didn't know either. The medicated version became their identity. Questions about whether this represented treatment of disease or chemical alteration of personality were philosophical rather than medical and went largely unexamined. The system had evolved beyond requiring pharmaceutical company intervention to maintain itself. Parents demanded diagnosis and medication for their children. Teachers identified potential ADHD students and encouraged medical evaluation. Doctors prescribed reflexively based on questionnaire responses. Insurance covered treatment without question. Schools accommodated diagnosed students while pressuring undiagnosed disruptive students toward evaluation. Patient advocacy groups like CHAD received millions from pharmaceutical companies while presenting themselves as independent voices representing patient interests. The groups lobbied for expanded insurance coverage, increased ADHD awareness, reduced stigma around medication, and better access to treatment. Their positions consistently aligned with pharmaceutical industry interests while claiming to represent grassroots patient concerns. Medical conferences examining ADHD were sponsored almost entirely by pharmaceutical companies. The conference venues, speaker fees, meals, and promotional materials all came from drug company budgets. Attendees received continuing medical education credits required for license maintenance. The education they received was carefully curated to emphasize underdiagnosis, treatment benefits, and pharmaceutical solutions while minimizing concerns about overdiagnosis or medication risks. Shire's stock price reflected investor confidence in the ADHD market's continued growth. Wall Street analysts projected continued expansion as awareness campaigns reached new demographics and lifelong treatment became standard. The market showed no signs of saturation. There were always more people to diagnose, more populations to target, more conditions to rebrand as ADHD variants. The diagnostic criteria in DSM-5, published in 2013, became even more inclusive than previous versions. The age of symptom onset requirement was raised from 7 to 12 years old. The number of symptoms required for adult diagnosis was reduced from 6 to 5. The examples provided for each symptom were expanded to capture more subtle manifestations. Each change widened the diagnostic net. Regional variations in diagnosis rates remained absurd. Some counties diagnosed 5% of children, while neighbouring counties diagnosed 25%. The variation correlated with physician prescribing patterns, school district policies, socio-economic status, and parental attitudes toward medication, not with actual behavioural differences in children. If ADHD was truly a biological brain disorder, its prevalence shouldn't vary fivefold between communities with similar demographics. The pharmaceutical industry dismissed these geographic inconsistencies as evidence of underdiagnosis in conservative areas rather than overdiagnosis in aggressive areas. Industry-funded researchers argued that 25% diagnosis rates represented appropriate recognition of ADHD prevalence, while 5% rates represented unconscionable denial of treatment to suffering patients. The possibility that 25% was absurdly high was never seriously considered. Prescription stimulant production increased 2,000% between 1990 and 2015, according to DEA manufacturing quotas. That exponential growth reflected expanded diagnosis, earlier diagnosis, adult diagnosis, and longer treatment duration. The numbers suggested either a genuine epidemic of neurological disorder affecting an ever-growing percentage of the population, or a pharmaceutical-driven medicalization of normal human behavioral variation. The DEA periodically expressed concern about prescription stimulant diversion and abuse, but the agency's production quotas continued increasing every year to accommodate growing legitimate prescription demand. The quotas were set based on pharmaceutical company forecasts of medical need, forecasts that consistently projected higher demand because higher demand generated higher profits. Pharmaceutical companies faced occasional lawsuits from patients claiming inadequate disclosure of risks or aggressive marketing of dangerous products. The companies settled these suits for millions or occasionally billions of dollars. But the settlements were tax-deductible business expenses that barely dented profits from decades of ADHD medication sales. Legal risks were simply costs of doing business, factored into financial projections and accepted as inevitable. The industry had created something unprecedented, a self-sustaining system where everyone involved had incentives to expand diagnosis and treatment, regardless of actual medical necessity. Parents wanted explanations for their children's struggles and access to performance-enhancing accommodations. Teachers wanted manageable classrooms. Schools wanted federal funding and improved test scores. Doctors wanted satisfied patients and avoided confrontation. Insurance companies passed costs to employers and policyholders. Pharmaceutical companies maximized profits. Nobody in the system benefited from reducing diagnosis or questioning whether treatment was appropriate. The machine operated automatically now, requiring minimal corporate intervention to maintain momentum. The diagnosis had achieved complete cultural normalization. ADHD was something everyone knew about, many people claimed to have, and nobody seriously questioned. The condition had become real through sheer repetition and institutional acceptance, regardless of whether it represented actual biological pathology or socially constructed category. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated ADHD diagnosis and prescribing beyond anything pharmaceutical companies could have orchestrated deliberately. Telehealth regulations were relaxed in March 2020. allowing doctors to prescribe controlled substances including stimulants through video consultations without in-person examinations. The temporary emergency measure became permanent policy in most states. Startup companies recognized the business opportunity immediately. Cerebral, Dunn, and dozens of similar ventures launched online platforms offering ADHD diagnosis and prescription through brief video appointments. Patients completed questionnaires, spoke with prescribers for 15 or 20 minutes, and received stimulant prescriptions sent directly to their pharmacy. The entire process took less than an hour. These telehealth platforms advertised aggressively on social media, targeting young adults struggling with pandemic disruptions to work and education. The advertisements promised quick, convenient ADHD evaluation and treatment. They emphasized that if you struggled with focus, organization, or motivation during lockdowns, you might have undiagnosed ADHD. The messaging connected pandemic-related stress and disruption to neurological disorder requiring pharmaceutical intervention. The platforms operated with minimal oversight. Prescribers were incentivized to approve diagnosis and prescribe medication because that determined whether patients continued using the service. A doctor who frequently declined to diagnose or prescribe would lose patients to competitors who were more accommodating. Market forces pushed toward generous diagnostic practices and liberal prescribing. Cerebral grew to 300,000 patients within 18 months, prescribing stimulants to the majority. The company was valued at over $4 billion at its peak. Investors viewed the telehealth ADHD model as revolutionary, using technology to expand access to treatment while generating massive profits through volume. The inevitable problems emerged quickly. Journalists investigated and discovered that some patients received Adderall prescriptions after 5-minute consultations. Whistleblower prescribers reported pressure to diagnose and prescribe to maintain patient retention metrics. The DEA began investigating several telehealth companies for potential violations of controlled substance prescribing regulations. But the damage was done. Or rather, the market expansion was accomplished. Millions of additional adults had obtained ADHD diagnoses and stimulant prescriptions through telehealth platforms. Many would continue treatment indefinitely even after regulatory crackdowns on the platforms that initially prescribed them. The telehealth boom had permanently expanded the patient population. Traditional healthcare systems had no choice but to accommodate the influx of newly diagnosed patients seeking prescription refills. A patient arriving with an existing ADHD diagnosis and stimulant prescription history was difficult to challenge. Doctors who questioned the validity of telehealth diagnoses risked being accused of denying legitimate medical care or discriminating against patients with disabilities. The pandemic also created a natural experiment revealing the subjectivity of ADHD diagnosis. Children learning remotely showed dramatic increases in ADHD symptoms according to parent and teacher reports. Kids who sat through classroom instruction adequately couldn't sustain focus during Zoom classes. But was this neurological disorder or simply normal response to inadequate educational delivery method? Schools and parents chose the medical explanation. ADHD diagnosis rates surged during 2020-2021 as remote learning exposed every child's attention limitations. Pediatricians were overwhelmed with requests for ADHD evaluation. Many prescribed stimulants based on parent reports alone without comprehensive assessment. The pandemic normalized even more aggressive diagnosis and prescribing than existed previously. By 2023, an estimated 10% of American children carried ADHD diagnoses. That percentage represented approximately 6 million children taking stimulant medications daily. The numbers varied wildly by region, race, and socioeconomic status, in ways that made no biological sense if ADHD was truly a neurological disorder. Affluent white communities showed diagnosis rates approaching 20-25% in some districts. These were areas with excellent schools, involved parents, and abundant resources. The high rates suggested either that privilege caused ADHD or that privileged families had better access to diagnosis and were more willing to medicate their children for competitive advantages. Poor communities and minority families showed dramatically lower diagnosis rates, despite children exhibiting similar or higher rates of behavioral difficulties. The disparity reflected limited access to healthcare, cultural skepticism towards psychiatric medication, and systemic biases in which children's behaviors were pathologized versus simply punished through disciplinary systems. The regional variations were even more absurd. Kentucky diagnosed ADHD in over 18% of children, while California diagnosed less than 5%. The difference couldn't be explained by genetic or environmental factors, making Kentucky children uniquely vulnerable to attention disorders. The variation reflected local prescribing cultures, school policies, and community attitudes toward medication. Prescription stimulants had become currency in high schools and colleges, more valuable than alcohol or marijuana. Students with legitimate prescriptions could sell pills for $5 to $20 each, generating significant income from their monthly prescriptions. The black market thrived because demand far exceeded legitimate prescription access. Many students wanted stimulants for academic enhancement, but couldn't or wouldn't pursue formal diagnosis. Universities struggled to address the problem without success. Students selling their prescriptions rarely faced consequences because proving distribution was difficult. Students using others' medications rarely sought treatment for stimulant abuse because the behavior was so normalized. The illegal market operated openly with minimal interference. Some students became psychologically dependent on stimulants obtained through friends or dealers. They used pills regularly for studying but had no legitimate prescription or medical supervision. When graduation eliminated their supply sources, they faced choices between pursuing diagnosis for prescriptions, buying from new dealers, or functioning without medications they'd used for years. The pharmaceutical industry's greatest achievement was creating a system where children spent their entire developmental years medicated without ever experiencing their unmedicated baseline. Kids started stimulants at age 6 or 7 and continued through high school. They didn't know who they were without medication. Their personalities, interests, and capabilities had developed entirely under pharmaceutical influence. Some of these lifelong patients reached adulthood and attempted to discontinue medication. The results were often devastating. Their brains had developed and matured while receiving daily stimulants. Removing medication revealed withdrawal symptoms and functional difficulties that confirmed in patients' minds that they definitely had ADHD and definitely needed lifelong treatment. Whether this represented genuine disorder or dependency created by years of continuous stimulant use was impossible to determine. Adult patients increasingly questioned whether they had ADHD or simply pharmaceutical dependency. People who'd taken stimulants for decades couldn't function without their medications. But was this because they had neurological disorders requiring treatment, or because their brains had adapted to regular amphetamine exposure and couldn't function normally when deprived? The question made many patients uncomfortable. Admitting they might be dependent on amphetamines rather than treating legitimate medical conditions threatened their self-concept and suggested they'd wasted years and thousands of dollars on unnecessary medication. Most chose to believe in their diagnosis rather than confront the possibility they'd been medicating normal human variation. Pharmaceutical companies faced growing legal challenges despite decades of successful operation. Lawsuits alleged that companies had knowingly marketed addictive stimulants to children, downplayed serious risks including cardiovascular problems and psychiatric side effects, and used deceptive marketing practices to expand diagnosis beyond legitimate medical necessity. Shire was acquired by Takeda Pharmaceutical in 2019 for $62 billion, one of the largest pharmaceutical acquisitions in history. The premium price reflected Vyvanse's value and the ADHD market's continued growth prospects. Takeda inherited both the profits and the legal liabilities from decades of aggressive ADHD marketing. The lawsuits resulted in occasional settlements, but never seriously threatened pharmaceutical profits. Companies would pay hundreds of millions in legal settlements that represented tiny fractions of the tens of billions generated from ADHD medication sales over decades. The settlements were tax-deductible business expenses that barely registered in corporate financial statements. Legal consequences functioned as minor costs of business rather than deterrents to aggressive marketing. State attorneys general investigated pharmaceutical marketing practices and occasionally extracted settlements for deceptive advertising or improper promotion. But these investigations moved slowly, took years to complete, and resulted in penalties that were insignificant compared to the profits generated during the time under investigation. By the time one marketing campaign was investigated and penalized, 3 new campaigns had already launched. The DEA reported that prescription stimulant production had increased 2,000% between 1990 and 2020. Amphetamine and methylphenidate manufacturing quotas rose continuously to accommodate growing legitimate prescription demand. The quotas were based on pharmaceutical company forecasts that consistently projected higher demand because higher demand meant higher profits. This created an absurd situation where the same amphetamine compounds banned from diet pill and pep pill markets due to addiction concerns were being produced at 20 times previous volumes for children and adults diagnosed with ADHD. The chemistry hadn't changed. The addiction potential hadn't changed. Only the marketing message and target population had changed. The central irony was impossible to ignore for anyone examining the history honestly. In the 1970s, regulators and medical authorities agreed that amphetamines were too dangerous for widespread use. They caused addiction, psychosis, cardiovascular problems, and psychological dependency. The medications were pulled from most markets and tightly restricted. 50 years later, those same medications were being prescribed to millions of children as young as 4 or 5 years old for conditions diagnosed subjectively based on behavioral questionnaires. Production had increased exponentially. The cultural attitude had transformed from "these drugs are dangerous" to "these drugs are essential medical treatment that millions of children need." The transformation wasn't driven by new scientific discoveries about brain chemistry or attention mechanisms. No breakthrough research revealed that amphetamines were actually safe when given to children for behavioral problems. The change resulted purely from pharmaceutical marketing successfully reframing dangerous drugs as essential medications and normal childhood behavior as neurological pathology. The system had achieved something remarkable, convincing millions of people that their children's normal energy, curiosity, and resistance to boring tasks represented brain dysfunction requiring chemical correction. Parents believed this. Teachers believed it. Doctors believed it. The diagnosed children and adults believed it. Everyone involved had constructed a shared reality where ADHD was obviously real, obviously common, and obviously required pharmaceutical treatment. But underneath that shared reality lay uncomfortable facts. The diagnosis was entirely subjective with no objective tests. The symptoms were universal human experiences occurring on a spectrum rather than discrete pathology. The medications were dangerous stimulants that had been banned from other uses due to addiction and health risks. The long-term benefits were minimal according to independent research. The primary effect was making children more compliant with institutional demands. Leon Eisenberg, whose research had legitimized ADHD diagnosis in the 1960s, gave a final interview shortly before his death in 2009. He expressed regret about how the diagnosis had expanded far beyond the severely impaired children he had studied. He called ADHD a prime example of a fabricated disorder that had been exploited for pharmaceutical profit. His comments were largely ignored by the medical establishment and pharmaceutical industry he'd helped create. The COVID-19 pandemic had exposed the system's absurdity. Millions of people diagnosed themselves with ADHD using 5-minute online questionnaires and received amphetamine prescriptions through brief video calls. If ADHD was truly a serious neurological disorder, such casual diagnosis and prescribing should have been scandalous. Instead, it was celebrated as improving access to treatment. The pharmaceutical industry had spent 70 years perfecting the model. Start with drugs that produce desired effects. Invent a diagnosis to justify using those drugs. Market the diagnosis aggressively to expand the patient population. Fund research supporting the diagnosis and treatment. Capture regulatory agencies through revolving door employment. Create patient advocacy groups that appear independent but advance industry interests. Normalize the diagnosis until questioning it seems unreasonable. The ADHD story was the template that other pharmaceutical companies studied and copied for conditions ranging from social anxiety to prediabetes to low testosterone. The formula worked because it aligned everyone's incentives. Pharmaceutical companies made profits. Doctors satisfied patients. Patients got explanations for their struggles. Schools managed behavior problems. Insurance companies passed costs to policyholders, and regulators avoided confrontation. The current state was absurd when examined objectively. Millions of children and adults were taking powerful stimulants daily for years or decades. The medications were chemically nearly identical to drugs everyone agreed were dangerously addictive when used recreationally. The diagnoses were based on subjective questionnaires rather than objective tests. The long-term safety data was inadequate. The benefits were modest. But questioning any of this was treated as denying legitimate medical care to suffering patients. The pharmaceutical industry hadn't cured a disease. They'd created one through decades of sophisticated marketing that convinced society to accept their framework. They'd transformed normal human behavioral variation into pathology, requiring pharmaceutical intervention. They'd made billions by selling the same drugs repeatedly under different names to populations that didn't exist until marketing campaigns created them. Charles Bradley's accidental discovery in 1937 that stimulants calmed hyperactive children was supposed to be a medical curiosity. Instead, it became the foundation for one of the most profitable pharmaceutical markets in history. The discovery itself was legitimate. Stimulants did reduce certain behavioral symptoms. But everything built on that discovery was pharmaceutical capitalism operating at peak efficiency, monetizing childhood behavior through medical reframing. The machine runs continuously now without requiring human guidance. Children enter kindergarten and get screened for ADHD. Teachers identify struggling students. Parents seek diagnosis. Doctors prescribe medication. Schools accommodate diagnosed students. Insurance pays claims. Pharmaceutical companies count profits. The diagnosed children grow into diagnosed adults who remain customers indefinitely. Every component reinforces every other component automatically. Breaking this system seems impossible because too many people benefit from maintaining it. Only the medicated children and adults themselves might suffer from unnecessary exposure to powerful stimulants, and they've been convinced their medication is essential for basic functioning. They're not victims demanding change, but satisfied customers defending their access to treatment. The ADHD story reveals pharmaceutical industry power operating at its most sophisticated. The companies didn't just sell pills. They sold a comprehensive worldview where normal problems required medical solutions, where pharmaceutical intervention was always appropriate, and where questioning diagnosis meant denying people medical care. That worldview became cultural common sense, accepted reflexively by most people, including many who would otherwise consider themselves skeptical of corporate power. The final irony is that nobody involved did anything obviously wrong. Pharmaceutical executives maximize profits legally. Researchers published legitimate findings within pharmaceutical-funded research ecosystems. Doctors prescribed medications that demonstrably reduced symptoms. Parents sought the best care for struggling children. Teachers wanted manageable classrooms. Everyone acted reasonably within their individual context while collectively creating something absurd. This is how billion-dollar drug industries are built. Not through obvious villainy, but through aligned incentives, sophisticated marketing, regulatory capture, and cultural normalization of profitable ideas. The system functions perfectly because questioning it requires rejecting common sense that millions of people have internalized. And the machine continues running, diagnosing more people, prescribing more medications, generating more profits from transforming the normal challenges of human attention and behavior into medical conditions requiring pharmaceutical correction. The industry that started with one doctor's accidental observation has become too large, too normalized, and too profitable to stop.